Halloween night, 1828. Edinburgh's Westport district. In a cramped lodging house on Tanner's Close, Margaret Docherty shared whisky with her hosts, two Irish labourers who claimed she might be distant family. By dawn, her body would be hidden beneath a bed, awaiting collection. But this time, someone was watching. Margaret Docherty was the 16th victim of William Burke and William Hare, two men who had pioneered a new horror, anatomy murder. They didn't rob graves, they created corpses, fresh, unmarked, and worth their weight in gold to Edinburgh's anatomy schools. For 10 months, they turned murder into a business, and the fog-shrouded closes of Edinburgh's old town became hunting grounds for the most calculating killers Scotland had ever known. This is the story of Burke and Hare, the body snatchers who never robbed a grave, the entrepreneurs of death who fed Edinburgh's insatiable appetite for medical knowledge, and the 16 souls whose murders would change the practice of medicine forever. It's a tale of greed and science, desperation and ambition, set in the dark heart of Georgian Edinburgh, where progress demanded bodies and two men were willing to provide them. Welcome to the Westport Murders.
To understand Burke and Hare, one must first understand Edinburgh in the 1820s. The city was the jewel of European medical education, renowned across the continent for its anatomical schools. Surgeons and physicians came as far as America to study in its lecture theatres. But there was a problem, a shortage so severe it had created an entire criminal industry. Scottish law permitted only the bodies of executed criminals, suicides, and unclaimed orphans to be used for dissection. Yet Edinburgh's medical schools needed hundreds of cadavers each year. Dr Robert Knox alone, one of the city's most celebrated anatomists, required nearly 90 bodies annually for his private anatomy school at Surgeons Square. The Judgment of Death Act of 1823 had reduced the number of executions dramatically. Fewer hangings meant fewer bodies. Demand vastly exceeded supply. And where there is demand, there will always be those willing to meet it. Enter the resurrection men, grave robbers who supplied fresh cadavers to anatomists for significant sums. But digging up graves was dangerous, labor-intensive work. Bodies had to be fresh, which meant working quickly. Watchmen guarded cemeteries. Families installed mort safes, iron cages over graves to prevent theft. The risk was considerable. William Burke and William Hare stumbled upon a simpler solution entirely by accident. Why dig up the dead when you could simply create them? Burke had arrived in Edinburgh from Ulster around 1818, working as a labourer on the Union Canal. Hare, also an Irish immigrant, ran a squalid lodging house on Tanner's Close in the Westport district. The two men became friends, united by their shared heritage and their fondness for drink. Neither had any medical knowledge, neither had any particular malice. What they had was opportunity and a complete absence of conscience.
November 1827. An elderly pensioner known as Old Donald died in Hare's lodging house, still owing £4 in back rent. Hare was furious at the loss of income. Burke suggested they might recoup the money by selling the body to the surgeons. After all, wasn't there always demand? They removed Donald's body from his coffin, replaced it with bark to maintain the weight, and carried the corpse through Edinburgh's winding closes to the university. A passing student directed them instead to Dr. Robert Knox' private anatomy school at Surgeons Square. Knox's assistant, a man named Ferguson, examined the body and paid them £7.10, without question. It was more money than either man had seen in months. The transaction took mere minutes. No questions about where the body had come from, no scrutiny whatsoever. Burke and Hare looked at each other with sudden understanding. Old Donald had died naturally, but surely bodies were bodies. The revelation was as simple as it was monstrous. Winter turned to spring. Another lodger at Hare's house, a man named Joseph, fell ill with fever. Burke and Hare plied him with whisky until he was insensible, then suffocated him. The method left no marks, no obvious signs of violence. They carried Joseph's body to Surgeons Square and collected another £10. Knox asked no questions. The system worked perfectly. By February 1828, Burke and Hare had discovered their calling. They refined their technique, intoxication first, then suffocation, pressing down on the chest whilst covering the nose and mouth. The victim would struggle briefly, then go still. It would later be called Burking, a verb created from Burke's own name, meaning to suffocate or to commit anatomy murder. They had invented a new way to kill.
The victims came from Edinburgh's most vulnerable populations. Abigail Simpson, a salt seller from Gilmerton, disappeared in February 1828. An English peddler suffering from jaundice vanished without trace. In April, 18-year-old Mary Patterson was lured to Burke's lodgings. She was young, reportedly beautiful, a familiar face in Edinburgh streets. Burke and his common-law wife Helen McDougall shared whisky with Mary and her friend Janet Brown until Mary passed out. Janet left. Mary never would. When Knox's students saw Mary Patterson's body on the dissection table, several recognized her. She had been alive mere days before. Her body was so fresh, so unmarked, that Knox had it preserved in whisky for 3 months before allowing dissection, using it as a demonstration piece. If he suspected anything, he said nothing. The money kept flowing. Through the spring and summer of 1828, Burke and Hare killed with increasing frequency and decreasing caution. An elderly woman who cleaned chimneys, a woman named Mrs. Haldane and her daughter Peggy, both lodgers, an elderly woman and her grandson, a deaf boy, murdered together. The method remained consistent. Whisky, suffocation, delivery to Surgeons Square, payment collected. £7 to £10 per body, split between the 2 men and their wives who helped lure victims and keep watch. The cloisters of the Westport became a hunting ground. Burke and Hare targeted those who wouldn't be missed: the elderly, the infirm, prostitutes, the destitute Irish immigrants like themselves. People whose absence would cause no alarm, whose disappearance would prompt no investigation. Edinburgh was a city of 60,000 souls. In the crowded, poverty-stricken Old Town, people vanished all the time. No one was counting. No one was watching. Burke and Hare believed they were invisible, untouchable, beyond consequence. They were wrong.
October 1828. James Wilson, known throughout Edinburgh as Daft Jamie, was 19 years old and had an intellectual disability. Despite this, he was no recluse.
Jamie was a familiar figure in the streets, known for his friendly nature and his habit of wandering the city. When Jamie disappeared, people noticed. Burke and Hare had broken their own rule. They had killed someone visible, someone recognizable, someone whose absence would be marked. When Jamie's body arrived at Surgeon Square, several of Knox's students immediately recognized him. They knew his face, his distinctive features, his well-known presence in Edinburgh's streets. The students whispered amongst themselves, but Knox proceeded with the dissection. He claimed later that he had not recognized the body, that by the time he examined it, the face had been altered. Whether this was true or convenient remains one of history's persistent questions. The students' suspicions went unreported. The dissection continued. Knox paid for the body as usual, but the noose was tightening. Burke and Hare had become arrogant in their success. 10 months of murders, 16 victims, hundreds of pounds collected. They had killed a child. They had killed the disabled. They had killed with such frequency that bodies arrived at Surgeon Square sometimes twice in a week. If Knox truly suspected nothing, he was remarkably incurious. If he did suspect, he was complicit through silence. Either way, the machine kept running. Whisky, suffocation, delivery, payment. An assembly line of death feeding Edinburgh's hunger for anatomical knowledge. The final victim would be their undoing. Margaret Docherty was a middle-aged Irish woman, alone in Edinburgh, looking for relatives. On Halloween 1828, William Burke claimed they might share family connections. Burke invited her to his lodging for drinks. Margaret Docherty accepted. She would never leave that room alive.
Halloween night. Burke's lodging was more crowded than usual. James Gray and his wife, Anne, were temporarily staying there whilst they searched for more permanent accommodation. This created a problem. Burke and Hare wanted Margaret Docherty dead, but the Grays were in the way. They convinced the Grays to spend the night at Hare's lodging instead, promising their bed would be available the following day. The Grays reluctantly agreed. That night, Burke, Hare, their wives, and Margaret Docherty drank together. When Margaret was sufficiently intoxicated, the men did what they had done 15 times before. By morning, Margaret's body was hidden beneath a bed, covered with straw, awaiting collection. The following day, Anne Gray returned to Burke's lodging to retrieve some belongings. Helen MacDougall tried to prevent her from going near the bed, but Anne's curiosity was aroused. When the room was briefly empty, Anne looked beneath the bed. She found Margaret Docherty's body still warm. Anne ran to find her husband. They hurried back together, intending to fetch the police, but encountered Helen MacDougall in the close. Helen offered them 10 shillings a week, a substantial bribe, to say nothing. The Grays refused. They went directly to the authorities. By the time the police arrived at Burke's lodging, the body was gone. Burke and Hare had already moved it to Surgeon Square. But the Grays' testimony was detailed and certain. The police went to Knox's anatomy school and found Margaret Docherty's corpse, freshly delivered, not yet dissected. Burke, Hare, and their wives were arrested on the 1st of November 1828. The 10-month killing spree was over. Edinburgh was about to discover that the bodies on its anatomy tables had not come from graves at all. They had come from murder, systematic and sustained, hidden in plain sight.
The investigation moved swiftly. Edinburgh police found themselves untangling a conspiracy almost too monstrous to believe. Witnesses came forward. Lodgers who had seen victims alive one day and gone the next. students who had recognized bodies on dissection tables, neighbours who remembered Burke and Hare carrying suspicious bundles through the closes at odd hours. The evidence was overwhelming, but there was a problem. Scottish law required corroboration, 2 witnesses to the same facts. Burke and Hare would each blame the other. Their wives would protect them. Without one of the perpetrators turning Crown witness, conviction would be difficult. The Lord Advocate made a calculated decision. William Hare was offered immunity in exchange for his testimony. He would confess everything, name every victim, describe every murder in detail. In return, he would go free. Hare accepted immediately. He had no loyalty to Burke, no conscience to trouble him, no hesitation whatsoever. On Christmas Eve, 1828, William Burke and Helen MacDougall stood trial at the High Court of Justiciary in Parliament House, Edinburgh. The courtroom was packed. The trial lasted 24 hours straight, through the night and into Christmas morning. Hare testified for hours, describing murder after murder with chilling matter-of-factness. He and Buck would get victims drunk. They would wait until the victim was helpless. One would hold the victim down whilst the other suffocated them, pressing on the chest and covering the mouth and nose. The bodies would be stripped naked to increase their value. Clothed bodies aroused suspicion. They would be folded into tea chests or sacks and carried to Surgeon Square, where Knox's assistants would pay without question. 16 victims over 10 months, nearly £200 in profit, a business built on suffocation and silence. The jury listened in horror. Helen MacDougall was acquitted. The case against her was deemed not proven, a uniquely Scottish verdict, meaning insufficient evidence.
William Burke was found guilty of murder. The judge donned the black cap and pronounced sentence. Burke would be hanged, and his body would be publicly dissected, the same fate he had imposed on 16 others. Poetic justice delivered by Scottish law. But the public wanted more than Burke's death. They wanted Knox. The anatomist had purchased 16 bodies over 10 months, each suspiciously fresh, several clearly recognizable, all delivered by the same 2 men. How could he not have known? Knox claimed complete ignorance. He had believed Burke and Hare were resurrection men, grave robbers, providing legal, if morally questionable, merchandise. He had asked no questions because anatomists never did. Asking questions might reveal answers one didn't want to know. The system ran on deliberate blindness. Knox was investigated but never charged. The evidence against him was circumstantial. He had purchased bodies, yes, but purchasing bodies was not illegal. Suspecting they might be murdered was not the same as knowing. The distinction saved him from the gallows, but destroyed his career. Edinburgh turned against Knox with fury. Mobs surrounded his house on Newington Place, smashing windows and burning effigies. His lectures were disrupted by protesters. Students abandoned his classes. The man who had been one of Europe's most celebrated anatomists became a pariah overnight. Within 3 years, Knox would leave Edinburgh entirely, his reputation in ruins, his career shattered. He had not wielded the suffocating hands, but he had created the market that made those hands profitable. The city's rage was not irrational. Meanwhile, William Hare walked free. His immunity held, despite public fury. In February 1829, he was released from prison and vanished from history. Some claimed he was attacked by a mob and blinded, living out his days as a London beggar.
Others said he fled to Ireland. No one knows for certain. He simply disappeared, whilst Burke faced his appointed end.
January 28th, 1829. The Lawn Market, Edinburgh. 25,000 people packed the streets, crowding windows and rooftops, straining for a view of the scaffold. It was the largest public execution crowd Edinburgh had ever seen. William Burke was led from the Tolbooth prison to the gallows. The crowd roared its approval, a sound like thunder rolling through the old town's narrow streets. Burke reportedly remained calm, refusing a last drink of whisky, perhaps an ironic gesture from a man who had used alcohol as his primary weapon. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the trapdoor opened, Burke dropped, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Children were held aloft to witness justice being done. Vendors sold pies and broadsides. It was spectacle, catharsis, and warning all at once. But Edinburgh was not finished with William Burke. His body was cut down and taken to the anatomy theatre of Professor Alexander Munro at the University of Edinburgh, Knox's rival. On January 29th, Munro publicly dissected Burke's corpse before an audience of students and invited observers. The theatre was packed. Munro lectured as he worked, pointing out anatomical features, demonstrating techniques. It was the ultimate irony. The man who had killed to provide bodies for dissection was now himself being dissected. His organs examined, his skeleton disarticulated, his humanity reduced to educational material. Students took souvenirs. Burke's skin was tanned and used to bind books. Several still exist in collections today, their covers made from human leather. His skeleton was articulated and mounted. It remains on public display at the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School to this very day, a permanent exhibition of justice served. Visitors can still see it, standing in its glass case, the bones of William Burke, anatomic murderer who created corpses to feed science and ended as a specimen himself. The punishment fit the crime with perfect, terrible symmetry.
The Burke and Hare murders did what decades of debate had failed to accomplish. They forced Britain to confront the grotesque hypocrisy at the heart of its medical system. Doctors needed bodies to train. The law permitted almost none. The inevitable result was a black market that rewarded grave robbery and eventually murder. The system had created Burke and Hare as surely as if it had handed them pillows to suffocate their victims. Attempts to reform the law were underway before Burke and Hare were even caught. A select committee was formed in April 1828, months before Margaret Docherty's murder. But it was the public horror of the Westport murders, the newspaper coverage, the trials, the execution, the sheer monstrousness of 16 murders for profit that finally pushed reform through Parliament. The Anatomy Act of 1832 changed everything. It allowed unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals to be used for dissection. It required anatomists to be licensed. It created oversight and regulation where before there had been only demand and secrecy. The supply of legal cadavers increased dramatically. The resurrection men found their trade obsolete overnight. The act was not perfect. It effectively meant that the poor would be dissected, whilst the wealthy remained inviolate, creating new ethical problems whilst solving old ones. But it ended the crisis that had created the market for Burke and Hare's murders. Medical education continued. Anatomy schools flourished, but they did so under law, not in the shadows. Today, Edinburgh still remembers. Walking tours guide visitors through the closes of the old town, pointing out Tanner's Close where Hare's lodging stood, Surgeon Square
where Knox received his grim deliveries. The sites are popular with tourists seeking dark history. Burke's skeleton remains in its case, a reminder of justice served. The verb to burk remains in the English language, meaning to suffocate or to suppress quietly. It is Burke's only lasting legacy, his name forever associated with murder.